kid is kicked out of his own family business. 30 years later, he returns as the autumn winds swept through the streets of Columbus, Ohio, and the city seemed oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions unraveling inside Jake Anderson. It was hard to believe 30 years had passed since he last crossed the state line, leaving behind his youth, his dreams, and most importantly, his family. Back then, he was just an ambitious young man, full of ideas, but also bitterness. Now, he was returning as a different man, powerful, ruthless, but still scarred by the past. Anderson Construction, once the pride of his family, stood in front of him like a shadow of its former self. The building, which had once been a symbol of success, now looked run down, its walls worn and windows dirty, showing signs of neglect. Jake's heart tightened at the sight of the company he once dreamed of leading, and now fate was offering him the chance he had long waited for, to save what was left of his family's legacy or bury it for good. 30 years earlier, a violent argument with his older brother, Brad, had changed his life forever. They were always like fire and water. Jake, bold and innovative, always looking for ways to modernize the business, and Brad, a traditionalist, loyal to their father Robert Anderson's methods. What started as a heated debate over the future of the company ended in a physical confrontation. That day, harsh words were exchanged, and in the end, Robert made the decision that sealed Jake's fate. "You're out, Jake. There's no more room for you in this family." And now, 30 years later, Jake was back, but not as the rejected, humiliated boy. He was a man who had built his own empire, who had survived years of hardships and challenges. But there was still an open wound: the broken relationship with his family, the weight of betrayal, and the burning desire to prove his worth. Jake looked at the entrance of the building one last time before stepping inside. His heart raced, but he kept a calm, expressionless face. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman, glanced up and her fingers trembled as she recognized the visitor. "Mr. Anderson?" she stammered, as if no time had passed. He gave a brief nod. "I'm here to see my brother." The woman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with his presence there. 30 years with no contact, and now Jake Anderson was back. But this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. He wasn't here for emotional reconciliations. He was here to take what was rightfully his. As he climbed the stairs leading to the main office, memories of his youth flooded back. Jake remembered the long afternoons spent beside his father, watching every decision, learning from every mistake. He had always believed he would one day inherit the company, but Robert's favoritism for Brad always stopped him from fully dreaming. "Brad knows how to run this business," his father used to say. "He understands what it takes to lead." What Robert never understood was that the world was changing, and with it, the demands of the market. Jake had always seen the future clearly: new technologies, sustainable methods, expansion into international markets. But Robert and Brad were blinded by tradition, by the fear of the new. And because of that, Jake was cast out, treated as a rebel without a cause. When he reached Brad's office door, Jake paused for a moment, listening to the muffled voices inside. He took a deep breath, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He knew his arrival wouldn't be welcomed. After all, his brother always thought he was in control, but now, the company's looming bankruptcy was proof that Brad had failed. And Jake was ready to take over. He opened the door without knocking, interrupting a meeting. Brad's face twisted with surprise and anger at the sight of Jake standing there, imposing, like a figure from the past come to haunt him. "Jake," Brad said, his voice filled with disdain. "What are you doing here?" Jake walked slowly into the room, each step calculated, his eyes never leaving his brother's. "I'm back, Brad, and this time I'm here to stay." The words echoed through the office, heavy with a weight that only the two of them understood. Jake Anderson's return wasn't just a visit. It was the beginning of a battle that would change everything. And with that, the ghosts of the past began to rise. The silence that followed Jake's words was suffocating. Brad, sitting behind his cluttered desk, stared at his brother with eyes that flickered between disbelief and anger. 30 years of unresolved tension filled the room like a storm brewing on the horizon. The other men in the meeting shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly aware of the family history but unsure of what to do. "You have some nerve?" Brad finally spat, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms. After all these years, you think you can just walk in here and what? Play hero? Jake didn't flinch. He knew his brother's game, and he wasn't going to take the bait. This isn't about playing hero, Brad. It's about fixing what you broke. His voice was calm but laced with a cold determination. He walked closer to the desk, placing his hands on it and leaning forward slightly. The company's drowning. I'm here to save it. Brad stood up suddenly, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor. Save it? He shouted, his face flushed with fury. You don't get to waltz in here after running off to God knows where and tell me how to run the business I've kept alive for the last 3 decades. You were nothing. Jake, you left. You gave up. This company doesn't need saving, and it sure as hell doesn't need you. Jake's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. He had expected resistance, but the venom in Brad's words still stung. I didn't leave, Brad. I was thrown out. There's a difference. The two brothers stood face to face now, the air between them crackling with years of bitterness. For a moment, it seemed like another physical altercation might break out, just like that fateful day 3 decades ago. But Jake wasn't that impulsive 18-year-old anymore. He had learned control, and he wasn't going to let Brad push him into another reckless move. Taking a step back, Jake scanned the room, noticing the way the others were watching, silent, expectant. The tension was palpable. You want to act like this company's fine? Jake asked, his voice now calmer but firm. Look around, Brad. These guys don't have the answers, and you sure as hell don't either. I've seen the books. Anderson Construction is hanging by a thread, and you know it. Brad clenched his jaw, but Jake wasn't done. I didn't come back to argue. I came back to help. He straightened up, adjusting his jacket. The way I see it, you've got 2 choices. You can keep pretending you've got everything under control until this place completely collapses, or you can let me step in and turn things around before it's too late. A heavy silence fell over the room once again, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Brad's face twisted into a scowl, but there was something else there too, a flicker of doubt. He could pretend all he wanted, but deep down, he knew Jake was right. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. His pride had been driving it into the ground, and now, the man he resented most stood before him with a lifeline. Before Brad could respond, the door to the office swung open, and an older man slowly stepped inside. His hair was white, and he walked with the aid of a cane. The room immediately shifted its attention to him. Robert Anderson, their father, had entered the scene. His presence was enough to silence everyone, but there was a heaviness in his movements now, a fragility that hadn't been there when Jake last saw him. "Dad?" Jake said, his voice softer than before. It had been so long. Robert looked different now, aged, frail. The once imposing figure of a man who had ruled over their lives and their family business now seemed so human. Robert's eyes, dim with years but still sharp with intelligence, scanned the room before resting on Jake. There was a long pause as the two locked eyes, 30 years of silence hanging between them. "Jake," Robert finally said, his voice rough but steady, "you came back." Jake nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "Yeah, Dad, I'm back." The older man sighed, looking between his 2 sons. "I heard what's going on." He turned his gaze to Brad, who seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of his father's attention. "The company, it's falling apart." Brad opened his mouth to argue, but Robert held up a hand. "I don't want excuses, Brad. I want the truth." The room was still, waiting for Brad to speak. But he didn't. Instead, his eyes darted between his father and Jake, anger simmering beneath the surface, but mixed with something else now, fear. Robert slowly made his way to the head of the table and sat down. He looked tired, like the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. "This company is my legacy," he said quietly. "It's all I have to leave behind, and I can't watch it die." Jake's heart tightened at the words. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years of anger and estrangement, he knew that this moment was bigger than their personal grudges. This was about the Anderson name, about saving something that had been built through decades of hard work and sacrifice. Robert looked up at Jake, his eyes pleading. "I need you to fix this, son, please." Jake stood there, momentarily speechless. His father had never once asked him for anything. In fact, Robert had always been the one giving orders, controlling everything and everyone. But now, in his frailty, he was asking for Jake's help. The weight of the decision pressed down on Jake. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? A chance to prove himself, to finally show his family that he was the one who could lead them out of this mess. But it wasn't going to be easy. Brad wouldn't give up control without a fight, and the company was in worse shape than anyone knew. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about redemption, about healing old wounds, or tearing them open even wider. Jake nodded slowly, locking eyes with his father. "I'll fix it, Dad. I'll fix everything." But as he said the words, he knew that the battle ahead was only just beginning. Jake walked out of the office, the weight of his father's pleas still heavy on his shoulders. The confrontation with Brad had stirred up emotions he thought he had buried long ago, and now Robert's fragile state only added to the complexity of his return. But Jake was no longer a young man looking for approval. He was here to fix things, and that meant confronting the mess his brother had made head-on. The cool air outside the building hit him like a wake-up call. He took a deep breath and looked around. The streets of Columbus were bustling as usual, people rushing by without a care. 30 years away had changed him in more ways than he could count, but the one thing that hadn't changed was his determination to succeed, no matter the odds. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. It rang twice before a confident voice answered. "Mr. Anderson," came the voice on the other end. "What can I do for you?" "Lucas," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'm going to need everything we talked about. Financials, contracts, project records, everything. I want a full audit of Anderson Construction's operations." There was a pause on the line. Lucas, Jake's trusted business partner from California, knew this was more than just a favor. It was the beginning of a takeover. "Understood. I'll have the team on it right away. Anything else?" "Yeah," Jake replied, glancing back at the worn-down building of his family's company. "I need it fast. This place is sinking faster than I thought." After hanging up, Jake knew it was time to dig in. If he was going to save the company, he needed to see just how deep the damage went. Brad had been running Anderson Construction into the ground for years, and Jake suspected there was more to the story than just bad business decisions. He had always known Brad was impulsive, but something about the way the company had fallen apart felt almost deliberate. The next morning, Jake returned to the office, ready to confront the truth. As he walked down the hall toward his father's old office, now occupied by Brad, he could feel the tension mounting. He pushed the door open without knocking. Brad was sitting at the desk, papers scattered in front of him. His eyes shot up as Jake entered, and the same flicker of resentment from the day before crossed his face. "I thought you left," Brad muttered, clearly irritated by his brother's presence. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake said, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk. Now." Brad leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What's there to talk about? You think you're just going to come in here and take over? You're living in a fantasy, Jake." Jake's patience was already thin. "This isn't about me taking over, Brad. This is about saving what's left of the company before it's too late. You and I both know Anderson Construction is barely keeping its head above water, and if you keep running it like this, it'll sink for good." Brad scoffed, but Jake didn't miss the flash of worry that crossed his brother's face. "I'm not stupid, Jake," Brad shot back. "I know things have been rough, but it's nothing we can't fix. We just need the right projects, the right investors. We're close." "Close to what? Bankruptcy?" Jake retorted, his frustration spilling over. "I've seen the numbers, Brad. You've been bleeding money for years, and now with Dad sick, it's only getting worse. The company is on the verge of collapse, and you're sitting here pretending everything's fine." Brad's face hardened, but he didn't deny it. "I've been doing my best," he said through clenched teeth. "Dad trusted me with this business. He gave it to me." Jake stepped closer, his voice low but full of intensity. "Dad gave you the business because he thought you could handle it. But look at what you've done, Brad. The company's a disaster, and it's not just because of the economy or bad luck. You've made reckless decisions, ignored the need for innovation, and now it's falling apart." Brad stood up, his fists clenched. "You don't get it, do you? You think this is all my fault? You think you could have done better? You left, Jake. You abandoned us. You don't know what it's like to be here, dealing with this day in and day out. You were out in California, building your little empire, while I was stuck here trying to keep this business alive. Jake met his brother's glare without backing down. I didn't abandon anyone, Brad. I was kicked out, and for 30 years, I've been waiting for a chance to come back and prove that I can do what you couldn't. So yeah, I know I could have done better. And now, I'm here to do exactly that. For a moment, the two brothers stood in a standoff, their emotions boiling just beneath the surface. Decades of unresolved anger and jealousy were laid bare in that office, and it was clear that this fight was about much more than just the business. "Fine," Brad said, his voice cold. "You think you can fix this mess? Go ahead. But don't think for a second that I'm just going to hand everything over to you. You want control? You're going to have to take it from me." Jake nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. "That's exactly what I plan to do." With that, he turned and walked out of the office, his mind already racing with the next steps. He needed to act fast. Brad wasn't going to make this easy, but Jake had faced bigger challenges before. This time, though, it was personal. As he walked down the hall, Jake noticed someone standing near the entrance of the office. A woman, probably in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and a clipboard in her hand. She looked like she had been waiting for him. "Mr. Anderson?" she asked, stepping forward. Jake stopped, recognizing her as the assistant who had been taking notes during the earlier meeting. "Yeah?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't mean to overstep, but you should know something." "About Brad." Jake raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "What is it?" She glanced around nervously before continuing in a hushed voice. "I've seen the financials. There's more going on here than what's on the surface. Brad, he's been hiding things. Big things." Jake's eyes narrowed. "What kind of things?" She looked down, clearly conflicted about revealing more. "I don't have all the details yet, but there are discrepancies in the contracts, payments that don't add up, and some of the projects Brad has been pushing, they aren't what they seem." Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had suspected something was off, but this confirmation made everything more real. Brad hadn't just been incompetent, he had been hiding something. "Get me everything you can find," Jake said, his voice serious. "I need to know exactly what's going on." The woman nodded, and Jake walked out of the building, his mind spinning with the revelation. This wasn't just about saving the company anymore. It was about uncovering the truth. And whatever Brad was hiding, Jake was determined to find it. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jake dove headfirst into the financials of Anderson Construction, his suspicions growing with each document he reviewed. He spent hours poring over contracts, payment records, and emails, his mind racing to connect the dots. Something was deeply wrong, and Brad's mismanagement wasn't just a result of incompetence. It was intentional. Jake's new ally, the assistant, whose name he learned was Emily, had been quietly digging through files on her end. Late one evening, just as Jake was about to leave the office, she knocked on his door, a thick folder in her hands. "I found something," she said, her voice low as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Jake gestured for her to sit and took the folder from her hands. "What are we looking at?" Emily leaned in, pointing to specific sections of the papers. "These contracts with a company called Granite Solutions, they're supposed to be for construction materials. But when I cross-referenced their payments, something didn't add up. The amounts they've been paid, they're way too high for what we've actually received. And get this," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Granite Solutions doesn't exist. It's a shell company." Jake felt a jolt of anger surge through him. "A shell company? Brad's been funneling money?" She nodded. "It looks that way. I don't know where the money's going, but it's not staying in Anderson Construction. He's been siphoning funds for months, maybe longer, and with the company in the state it's in, that kind of drain could finish us off." Jake clenched his fists. It all started to make sense. The company's rapid decline, Brad's strange behavior, the missing funds. His brother wasn't just an incompetent leader. He was a liar and a thief, stealing from the very business their father built with his own hands. The realization burned inside Jake like a fire. "I need proof," Jake said, standing up, his mind racing with the implications. "Something solid that ties Brad directly to this." Emily nodded, already prepared. I've got more files at home. I couldn't bring everything here. It's too risky. But there's enough in this folder to start a full investigation. Jake's mind was already moving a mile a minute, thinking about what needed to happen next. Brad had crossed a line, and this wasn't just about business anymore. This was about family, about betrayal, and Jake wasn't going to let it slide. The next morning, Jake made his move. He arranged a meeting with Robert, requesting Brad's presence as well. The office felt heavy with the tension, the quiet hum of the air conditioner doing little to ease the building storm. Brad arrived first, his usual smugness barely masking the anxiety Jake could see creeping in. "What's this about, Jake?" he asked, slumping into one of the chairs in the conference room. "Another one of your big ideas?" Jake didn't answer, keeping his eyes fixed on the door until their father shuffled in, supported by his cane. Robert looked tired, more worn than ever. The sight of him only fueled Jake's determination. Robert deserved to know the truth. Once everyone was seated, Jake didn't waste any time. "Dad, we've got a serious problem. The company is bleeding money because Brad's been stealing it." Brad shot out of his chair, his face twisting in outrage. "Are you out of your mind? I've been keeping this place alive. You don't know what you're talking about, Jake." But Jake remained calm, pulling out the folder Emily had given him and sliding it across the table to his father. "Look at the numbers, Dad. The contracts, the payments. Brad's been siphoning money through a fake company for God knows how long. It's all right there." Robert hesitated, his trembling hands reaching for the documents. He glanced at Brad, whose face had gone pale, then back at the papers in front of him. As he flipped through the pages, his expression hardened, his eyes growing darker with each passing second. "Brad?" Robert said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Is this true?" Brad's bravado faltered. His mouth opened and closed as if searching for the right words, but no excuses came. His silence spoke volumes. Jake leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You betrayed this family. You didn't just mismanage the company, you stole from us, from Dad." Brad's face twisted in anger, but there was a flicker of guilt behind his eyes. "I had no choice," he finally shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "Do you think I wanted this? The company was falling apart, and I had to make deals to keep us afloat. You wouldn't understand. You left us, Jake. I was the one who stayed. You stayed to bleed us dry." Jake shot back, his anger boiling over. "You let your greed destroy this company, and now you want to act like a victim?" Robert's voice cut through the heated exchange, low and full of disappointment. "Enough." He lowered the documents, his eyes filled with sadness. "Brad, how could you?" Brad, standing at the edge of the room now, looked at his father with desperation. "Dad, I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I could fix it, make it right, but things got out of control. I was trying to protect the company." "By stealing from it?" Robert asked, his voice heavy with grief. "You didn't protect anything. You destroyed everything I worked for." Jake watched his brother crumble under their father's words. A part of him almost felt sorry for Brad, but the years of betrayal were too deep to ignore. There was no turning back now. "I want you out," Robert said finally, his voice trembling, but resolute. "You're no longer part of this company." Brad's face twisted in disbelief. "Dad, no." "It's done," Robert said, his eyes locking with Brad's. "Leave." The silence that followed was deafening. Brad stood there, stunned, before storming out of the room without another word. The door slammed shut behind him, and the weight of the moment settled heavily in the air. Jake looked over at his father, who seemed smaller than ever, as if the truth had taken the last bit of strength he had left. "Dad," Jake said softly, unsure of what else to say. Robert sighed deeply, his eyes filled with regret. "I should have listened to you, Jake. All those years ago." Jake's chest tightened at his father's words, a mix of relief and sadness washing over him. This wasn't the victory he imagined. There was no satisfaction in watching his brother fall apart, and no joy in seeing the pain in his father's eyes. But the truth was out now, and Jake knew that saving the company would require more than just exposing Brad's lies. It would take rebuilding trust, not only with the business, but with his family. And that, Jake realized, might be the hardest part of all. The days following Brad's departure felt like a whirlwind. The once chaotic office was now eerily quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The The news of Brad's betrayal had spread quickly, and the staff's loyalty shifted toward Jake. Not out of fear, but out of hope. They knew something had to change, and Jake, with his years of success and clear vision, seemed like the only person who could save the sinking ship that Anderson Construction had become. Jake, however, didn't see it as a victory. Watching Brad fall apart, witnessing the devastation in their father's eyes, it had all left a bitter taste. But there was no time to dwell on it. The company was in dire straits, and they couldn't afford to waste another minute. Every decision Jake made from now on would determine whether Anderson Construction could rise from the ashes, or if it would be reduced to just another failed family business. Jake sat in his father's office, now his office, reviewing reports Emily had helped compile. The extent of Brad's reckless spending and poor investments was even worse than he'd imagined. There were unpaid invoices, contractors threatening lawsuits, and projects abandoned mid-construction. He felt a sense of urgency building within him. There wasn't much time to turn this around. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Emily stepped inside, carrying a cup of coffee and a thick binder of files. She placed the coffee on the desk and handed over the binder, her expression a mix of concern and quiet confidence. "Here's everything you asked for," she said. "It's a full breakdown of all the active contracts and the most critical issues. The ones we need to deal with immediately." Jake flipped open the binder, his eyes scanning the first page. "Thanks, Emily," he muttered, but his mind was already turning over solutions. They needed money, fast. But more than that, they needed credibility again. The Anderson name had been dragged through the mud with Brad's schemes, and getting contractors and investors to trust them would be an uphill battle. Emily lingered by the desk, clearly hesitating before speaking. "Jake," she began cautiously, "I know it's been a rough few days, but how's your father holding up?" Jake paused, leaning back in his chair. "He's not great," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. "Losing Brad like that after everything, it's hit him hard." Robert had barely spoken since the confrontation with Brad. The betrayal had shattered something deep within him, and it was clear that the toll was more emotional than just the business. Seeing his eldest son fall so far had broken Robert's spirit. He spent most of his time at home now, bedridden and silent, staring out the window as if searching for answers that would never come. "I'm worried about him," Jake continued. "But right now, I need to focus on fixing the company. I owe him that much." Emily nodded, her face softening with empathy. "If anyone can pull this off, it's you. The staff's behind you, Jake. They believe in what you're doing." Jake managed a small, grateful smile. "Thanks. That means a lot." As she left the office, Jake turned his attention back to the binder. He needed to stabilize things before making any bold moves. First on the list was renegotiating with their biggest contractors. If they could reassure them, secure new terms, maybe they could buy enough time to get their most critical projects back on track. But they needed more than just new terms. They needed a new vision, something that would inspire confidence. Jake spent the next week working around the clock. Every call, every meeting, every decision was made with precision. He met with contractors, suppliers, and potential investors, presenting a new plan for Anderson Construction, one focused on innovation, green technology, and future-forward design. It wasn't easy. Many were hesitant, some downright hostile. But Jake's persistence and his track record of success in California spoke louder than the company's recent failures. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling negotiation with a key supplier, Jake received an unexpected visitor. He was in the middle of reviewing plans when the door to his office creaked open. He looked up, expecting Emily, but instead there stood his father, Robert Anderson, leaning heavily on his cane but with a determined look in his eyes. "Dad?" Jake said, surprised to see him up and about. "You should be resting." Robert shook his head. "I've rested enough. It's time for me to face the mess I let happen." Jake stood up, guiding his father to a chair. He noticed how much weaker Robert looked now, his once broad shoulders sagging under the weight of age and regret. But there was still a fire in his eyes, a spark of the man who had built Anderson Construction from the ground up. "I've been thinking a lot, Jake," Robert began, his voice rough. "About you, about Brad, about everything." Jake remained silent, letting his father speak. He had been waiting for this conversation for years, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to expect. "I made mistakes," Robert continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought I was protecting this family by keeping you and Brad apart, by trying to control everything. But I was wrong. I should have listened to you. I should have given you the chance to lead." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. Hearing those words from his father, words he had longed to hear for so long, felt like both a relief and a wound reopening. The years of distance, of rejection, weighed heavily between them. "You did what you thought was best, Dad," Jake said quietly. "But I'm here now, and I'm going to fix this." Robert's eyes softened with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I know you will. You're the one who can rebuild this company. The way I see it, the only legacy worth leaving is one built on trust, not control. And I trust you, Jake." For the first time in years, Jake felt the tension between them begin to dissolve. There was no more need for approval, no more desperate grasping for acknowledgement. Robert's words were enough. He had finally given Jake the one thing that had always been missing: his trust. Robert reached out, placing a trembling hand on Jake's arm. "You've already proven you're a better man than I ever was, Jake. And I'm proud of you." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. They sat in silence for a few moments, the quiet between them filled not with distance, but with understanding. The healing had begun, but there was still so much work to do. Anderson Construction wasn't just a business, it was their family's story, and Jake was determined to write the next chapter with integrity and purpose. As Robert stood to leave, he turned to his son one last time. "Save the company, Jake, but more importantly, save yourself from the mistakes I made." Jake nodded, watching as his father slowly made his way out of the office. The burden of responsibility now rested fully on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to carry it. The rebuilding had truly begun. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Jake's life. Every day was a battle to keep Anderson Construction afloat. He juggled meetings with suppliers, renegotiated contracts, and finalized deals that would breathe life back into the company. The tension was high, but so was his determination. Jake knew that this was his last chance, not just to save the family business, but to cement his legacy as the man who did what no one else could. Emily remained by his side through it all, providing key insights and running operations while Jake focused on strategy. Together, they began turning the tide, bit by bit. Contractors who had once been skeptical started showing renewed interest, and old clients cautiously reached out, hearing that Jake Anderson was serious about reviving the company. But the true test came one afternoon in the form of a meeting with Marcus Hale, a powerful investor who held a critical stake in Anderson Construction's future. Marcus had been circling the company for years, waiting for the right moment to swoop in and buy it out. For him, Anderson Construction wasn't about family or legacy, it was about leverage and profit. And with the company still teetering on the edge, Marcus saw an opportunity. Jake sat across from Marcus in the boardroom, the tension thick in the air. Marcus was a sharp, calculating man with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He leaned forward, placing a contract on the table between them. "This is a generous offer, Jake," Marcus said smoothly, his voice oozing with false charm. "I'll buy out Anderson Construction, take on the debts, and leave you with a nice sum to walk away with. You've done well, given the circumstances, but it's time to let go." Jake glanced down at the contract, feeling the weight of Marcus's offer. It was tempting, an easy way out. The money would be enough for him to live comfortably for the rest of his life. He could walk away, leave the chaos behind, and never have to deal with the mess of his family's legacy again. But as he looked at the paper in front of him, something stirred inside. This company wasn't just about money or success. It was about the name on the building, the years of sacrifice his father had poured into it, and it was about Jake himself, the young man who had been cast out but fought his way back, not just for vengeance, but for redemption. Jake lifted his eyes to meet Marcus's gaze. "I'm not selling," he said firmly. Marcus's smile faltered for a moment. "Think about it, Jake. This is your chance to leave the past behind. Why keep fighting a losing battle?" "I'm not fighting a losing battle," Jake replied, his voice steady. I'm building something new. Anderson Construction isn't going to fold, and it sure as hell isn't going to end up in your hands." Marcus's eyes darkened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Jake said, standing up and pushing the contract back across the table. "But it's my mistake to make." With that, Jake walked out of the boardroom, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time, he wasn't carrying the weight of trying to prove himself to anyone, his father, his brother, or even the world. He was doing this for himself, for the company, and for the future he wanted to build. The next few months were a whirlwind of rebuilding. Slowly but surely, the company began to stabilize. New projects were secured, and with Jake's leadership, Anderson Construction started to regain the reputation it had lost under Brad's control. The name Anderson meant something again: strength, innovation, and resilience. But it wasn't just the business that was healing. Jake's relationship with his father, though still fragile, had started to mend. Robert, weakened by his years of hard work and the emotional toll of losing Brad, grew quieter but more present. He would visit the office occasionally, watching from the sidelines as Jake led the company forward, a silent nod of approval in his gaze. One evening, after a long day at the office, Jake received a call from Robert's nurse. His father's condition had worsened. Jake rushed to the house, finding Robert in his bed, his breathing shallow but his eyes still clear. Jake sat by his side, taking his father's frail hand in his own. "You did it, son," Robert whispered, his voice weak but filled with pride. "You saved the company." Jake shook his head, his throat tightening with emotion. "We saved it, Dad, together." Robert smiled softly, closing his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Jake, more than you'll ever know." Those were the last words Robert Anderson spoke. He passed peacefully that night, leaving behind a legacy built on hard work, mistakes, and redemption. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by family, friends, and longtime employees of Anderson Construction. Jake stood by the grave, feeling the weight of loss, but also a sense of closure. His father was gone, but the lessons learned, both the good and the bad, would stay with him forever. As the sun began to set over the Ohio hills, Jake turned to Emily, who stood quietly by his side. "What now?" she asked softly. Jake looked out over the horizon, his heart heavy but his spirit unbroken. "Now," he said, "we keep building." Anderson Construction would continue. It wasn't just a company anymore. It was a symbol of everything Jake had fought for and everything he would continue to fight for. Not for power or money or even recognition, but for the family legacy that had shaped him, and for the future he would carve out with his own hands. And so Jake Anderson walked away from the grave, ready to face whatever challenges came next, with the weight of the past behind him, and the promise of tomorrow ahead. Wait, before you go, remember Mia and Sophie? That tense night was just the beginning. But what secrets does Sophie's crumpled drawing hold? And who's really after them? Trust me, the twists you're about to see will blow your mind. Don't miss what happens next. Click the video on your screen now.